Hello, I'm Dr. Bruce Long. I'm currently campaigning and nominating for the Senate, that's the upper house of Parliament in Australia. I want to address a couple of foreign policy and domestic security issues and then make an appeal. First, to Sino-Western relations and Australia's relationship with the United States and China. The delusional megacult pundits employed by Murdoch-owned and other mass media in this country are beating Mad Mike Pizzullo's drums of war like delusional warmongering crazy persons. You've all seen this, so I don't really need to provide examples, but I'll set some context anyway. Okay, I'll provide some examples. Here's one example. Just tune in to Catholic megacult crazy person Peter Credlin, or to any other Sky News or Phone News talking head on any given day. By the way, I should point out that when Sky News declares in headlines that talking head X says that Y, we should all just have a good laugh, a really good belly laugh. With respect to journalistic integrity, journalistic license, and journalistic credentials, journalists with bachelor's degrees, and a lot of these presenters don't even have that. They're important as potential agents of freedom of speech, but they're not qualified to make declarations about China's geostrategic and ideological motives and economic policies, not without at least a master's degree in those fields, or else close collaboration with a specialist that has such qualifications. They can speculate and ask intelligent questions. Well, some of them can ask intelligent questions, with research attached. And the word research is also being used probably very generously there. But just declaring or spouting or blurting out things like China is an imminent threat to all Australians, and certainly, China is an imminent military threat to all Australians and to Australia, is not any of those things. What it is, I put it to you, fellow Australians and Australian citizens, is just plain stupid. I often feel sorry for these presenters, as they're clearly just trying to keep their job in a pandemic and keep their boss happy. And the anxiety and the strain does often show on their faces, I think. So, Sino-Australian relations are under strain. That much is not in question or in doubt. The Western mass media, at the behest of Western elites, use that term generously here because they're monetarily and from the perspective of the fact that they have links to an influence over or a potential influence over the largest militaries in the world, they can be considered elite. But from an intellectual, academic, and cultural perspective, and in any other way that matters, not so much. Not so much elites. Anyway, the Western mass media, at the behest of these so-called elites, and at the behest of the Western US military-industrial complex, and obviously, yes, that is a thing, they're all blaming China. I'm sure China does bear some responsibility. However, many wise people know that China's, not even centrally responsible. Many wise people, such as Professor James Lawrenson from the Australia-China Relations Institute at the University of Technology in Sydney, have been trying to stem the tide of nonsense and idiocy from these misinformation sources for some time. I hate to pick on the professor again, but he is one of the only people in the country with their heads screwed on straight regarding these matters. Recent data shows that our iron ore exports to China have reached record highs, and Professor Lawrenson has been reminding us all for weeks, months now, that similar dynamics are still occurring in Sino-American trade relations. And the US is actively trying to bolster and develop, those trade relations and improve them, whilst undermining our trade relations with China by coercing us to participate in actions in the South China Sea that are not only potentially harmful and dangerous for us and for our ADF personnel, but that put us in an asymmetrically weak position in relation to China, a position that the United States doesn't share because of its size and strength. Being that I'm a progressive political absurdist and pragmatist, I'm not a communist or a socialist, and so I have nothing against free markets in principle. But that's okay, since clearly neither does the world's largest communist government in China, which for 40 years at least has been doing its damnedest to integrate with the global free market rules-based order and to compete on a basis that has been just as fair, probably a lot more fair, than the basis upon which the US and the UK compete in that global free market rules-based order. Under those circumstances, I'm simply not interested in having my 3 children live through an era of increased risk of escalating global conflict, and certainly not some stupidly conceived kinetic war in the South China Sea, because some ultra-rich but otherwise not elite sociopaths want better profits, and or because they're racist xenophobes, especially not because some delusional, misatheist, infidelophobic sociopath with an imaginary friend thinks that it's bad for the government of the world's largest nation to be atheist or godless. In other words, not delusional. So, when delusional nincompoops from Phone News or Sky News or any of the commercial news services in the West start spouting voluminous misinformation, I believe the technical term for it is lots of abject bullshit, that war with China is somehow necessarily imminent, it puts my bullshitometer well into the red. The US does not give a flying fig about democracy or freedom of religion in other nations, except where they regard that those things serve their, and talking about those things and making a noise about those things, serve their geopolitical and geostrategic and, of course, economic interests. Irresponsible, ignorant, and integrity-free commercial journalists and mentally ill mega-cult talking head current affairs pundits are bad enough. However, there are more brazen examples of dangerous and irresponsible, and probably criminal, disinformation and misinformation agents in this country. Just Google ASPI, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, and listen to whatever nutty mega-cultist is using them as a source or authority. ASPI is a very important and interesting case in point, and it brings me to my first appeal to Australians and Australian voters. The appeal is for you to get on your computers and on the internet and go to the link on your screen, which is, I believe, also listed below the video in the comments, and sign parliamentary petition number EN2804. What is this a petition about? It's about the fact that while abject scaremongering and warmongering nonsense about some overarching threat posed by our friendly trading partner China is constantly being vomited from the mouth of the media ignorati in this country, at the same time, local research institutes funded and controlled, or at least undoubtedly heavily financially and politically influenced by foreign intelligence agencies via foreign commercial interests and governments that are based in the US and UK, these agencies, institutes, are directly and unabashedly influencing our politics, our government policies, including geostrategy, economic policy, and foreign policy at least. In 2017, the Turnbull government introduced strict foreign interference and influence laws into our criminal code, moving some of them from the Crimes Act whilst boosting their scope and implications. There's a lot in these laws, but they essentially say that if one knowingly assists any foreign intelligence agency to influence and affect our government policies, our politics, and our political system, then it's a criminal act. I suspect that the US and UK and European governments and their intelligence agencies only and easily get away with using such puppet research agencies as ASPI in this manner by lining the pockets of political allies, and because those governments and intelligence agencies know that as a nation we're complacent. We're largely both ignorant and lackadaisical when it comes to interference by the US and the UK in our political systems. I shouldn't overgeneralise. Not all of us are. Interestingly, in the 1980s, our former Prime Minister Bob Hawke wasn't. He was definitely trying to enlist the help of the United States in getting rid of the British Crown, or at least, lessening the power and influence of the British Crown, which latter outcome I fully support. But that's a digression and a matter for another talk. Perhaps some of you might think that the kind of interference being done by ASPI and by foreign governments and intelligence agencies through agents of foreign influence like ASPI is somehow harmless, tolerable, or even positive. Well, if the formulators of the 2017 updates to our foreign interference laws are to be taken seriously, then no, apparently not. And sensibly, no, of course not. This is Australia. Now, I'm no overblown nationalist. I'm not really a nationalist. I'm a political pragmatist and a globalist first. And there's a lot that can be said about those things. But clearly, we are not the United States. We're not a state of the United States, and we're not the UK. I don't see how it's harmless to get Australia involved in a harmful and completely unnecessary trade war with China, and to put our defence forces completely unnecessarily and ulteriorly in harm's way as part of an expensive taxpayer-funded exercise in militaristic adventurism in the South China Sea on behalf of the United States. And the Quad nations that they've partnered with there. And, the partnership is quite asymmetrical. And we're not one of the larger players, and we don't benefit in any way in the same way as the United States does. And I think to claim that we do is simply disingenuous. Keep in mind that the US is still trying to develop stronger trade ties and to profit from relations with China. As the Australia-China Relations Centre at the University of Technology Sydney has pointed out again recently, there's a lot of rhetoric from the US about having Australia's back, as it were, but their actions seem a lot more like, well, to be honest, backstabbing by way of both inaction and arrogant coercion. When I pointed out that local brink tanks, as in brink of war tanks, like ASPI, were clearly trammeling foreign interference laws, and I formulated the parliamentary petition that I just mentioned to have them investigated by the relevant committees, I'm sure that there were many who furiously ignored me, whilst also at the same time calling me some kind of crank. Well, I submit to you that those who did so are either ignorant idiots, treating you as an ignorant idiot, or else they're worried because they know very well that they have a serious problem. In fact, it's all of those things. If I was wrong and there's no cause for concern, why have there recently been many calls for the legislation that I'm talking about, the 2017 updated legislation against foreign influence and interference? Why are there calls for it recently to be updated to specifically refer to China and to exclude other foreign powers? I'll tell you why, because I wasn't wrong at all. Those parties are rightly concerned that there are Australian research think tanks, as I said, brink tanks, who should definitely be in big trouble for flagrantly breaking these foreign influence interference laws, and for being paid to do so, and for using Australian taxpayer money to do so. I've numerously pointed out in media streams and articles since at least the start of the year that the actions and activities of local policy research institutes and policy shops should be investigated pursuant to these foreign influence laws and interference laws. Now consider the setup of ASPI, aside from the fact of, the way that they're funded and financed. Their setup is important. They're set up as a policy shop that co-specializes in military, geostrategy, politics, and weapons technology, among other things. Do you remember when they made a recommendation that Australia should buy B-2 bombers from the US? They've posted numerous puff pieces dressed up as research and research articles that can easily be interpreted or construed. In fact, they just are nudge and viral marketing for US and European military technology firms. You honestly think there's no connection between US and European and UK military technology firms and US, UK, and European intelligence agencies? Come on. They're funded by those the ASPI Research Institute, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, are funded by those foreign influence agents, and they use Australian taxpayer money to do marketing for those foreign influence agents. Let me run through just a couple of examples of the kind of nonsense that these sociopaths spout on a regular basis, with some quick debunking statements. First, China is an immediate and imminent military threat to Australia. This is just patent nonsense. This is not Hollywood. There's no Red Dawn. It's funny, by the way, how there have been two of those idiotic movies already, and never a single sign that any such invasion of the West is even remotely likely. China's going through the geostrategic and geopolitical and military, to a significant extent, machinations of finishing the business of their communist revolution. They're going through the machinations of redressing the evils of what was called the White Terror, which was a massacre and genocide perpetrated upon communist intellectuals and civil servants in Taiwan at the end of the revolution by the Chinese Kuomintang, or in fact the Taiwanese Kuomintang. That's the alleged government of Taiwan, which of course Beijing doesn't recognize. And note carefully, by the way, the Kuomintang that currently allegedly control, or actually control Taiwan, or significantly control Taiwan as puppets of the US and the CIA, and if you want to argue with me about that, then you're going to have a hard time, I can assure you. Politically, those agents, the Kuomintang, they're all originally from mainland China. That's something important to keep in mind, I think. Look at a map of the South China Sea. Taiwan's only about 130 kilometres from the mainland of China at its closest point, and that's within artillery range, let alone missile range. It's very much a local, regional, geopolitical and geostrategic matter. It's very local to that region. The US is not interfering for democracy or for human rights, nor for religious freedom. They're not. Are you kidding me? Those things only matter to the US, as I've said, in as much as they are ways of securing a foothold in the region, or making a noise about those things, or a way of securing support for their securing a foothold in the region for their intelligence assets and geopolitical and geostrategic coercion. Here's an interesting history lesson for you that might serve to demonstrate how ulterior the US can be in relation to geostrategic matters. When the US used atomic weapons against Japan at the end of the Second World War, there was an enormous Catholic population, for example, in and around Nagasaki. This did not stop the unnecessary atomic attack on an already defeated nation. Why? Because the primary real motivation for the action, the atomic bomb being dropped on Nagasaki, is likely to have been the advance. In fact, military historians and political historians know that the primary and real motivation was the advance of the Soviet Union, the then Soviet Union, into Manchuria to liberate the Chinese in that region from the onslaught of Japanese imperialism. Note also that when the Soviets successfully completed that task, they completely withdrew all of their political and military agents and forces. The problem was that the problem for the United States was that the Soviet forces were about to then advance on Japan itself. That's why the Americans nuked Nagasaki, and it's significantly and primarily the reason, to prevent the socialist Soviet Union from crossing the South China Sea into Japan. So the US is no better behaved as a global agent now. They have not even ratified UNCLOS, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which is the international treaty which was adopted and signed by many nations in 1982. That's a kind of rules-based order for how to behave on our oceans and in international regions of international waters. Yet the US cite this treaty as a reason for opposing China's moves within the 9-dash line. Now this matters. It speaks to the total lack of integrity exhibited by the US Department of State and Pentagon on these issues. Even more embarrassingly for the US and Western media recently attacked China for trammeling this treaty. Again, they've attacked China numerously on this basis, but only to have the entire social media world remind the US that they did it first, that is, disrespected UNCLOS. And since they claim to be the leader of the free world, China can plausibly and fairly claim that since the US doesn't regard the treaty as important, then neither should anyone else. The US can ignore it while all other nations have to comply with it. What's that? It's not fair, that's what that is, at minimum. The last nation that should be criticising China for trying to recover a secessionist province is the fiercely nationalistic US, who just completed another phase of their longest ever war, held, as usual, far away from their own borders in Afghanistan. A country that is, it's never been part of the US and is nowhere near the US. I'm not here talking to you today just to stop the continued abuse of our country as a lackey for US and British foreign monetary elites and their agents of influence. I have solutions for better approaches to getting what we want and need in terms of prosperity, regional security, and technological advancement. What are some of those solutions? Well, I won't go into them deeply because I've already talked enough today, but here are a couple of basic steps to get started. Step 1, just get the British Crown out of our courts and Parliament now. Does this sound like too big of an ask or nonsensical? I think not. And the entire Republican movement in this country, which understandably has significant support, agrees with me, or maybe I should say I agree with them. Step 2, properly enforce our foreign influence laws and foreign interference laws against the US and the UK and against their intelligence agencies. We're not Britain and we're not the US, and nor are we China. I'm not a nationalist, I'm a globalist. But, I mean, we need some fair balance in these matters. The US wouldn't accept any such influence by us in their nation, and they certainly wouldn't accept any such influence by China in their nation, and they're making a huge fuss about that kind of thing now, even though mostly it's not even happening. Step 3, we really should partner with China. We've got to stop being paranoid, folks. On the BRI, we should partner with China on Xi's Belt and Road Initiative, in a limited format at least, by joining, for example, their space program, and thus fortifying our regional security. As a progressive political pragmatist and absurdist, a communist atheist governed China does not worry me nearly as much as a nation, for example, of delusional fundamentalists and obviously doctrinally infidelophobic and misatheist Islamic megacultists sitting right next to our northern borders. I mean, those nations have Sharia police squads, for goodness sake, that go around flogging the sexually liberated and free-thinking, and that terrorise apostates and sexually and intellectually liberated women. It's obscene, absolutely obscene that we favour them over China. So in closing, here's one other important practical step to take. As I've already said, please visit the links on your screen and sign petition EN2804. That's petition EN2804. It's a parliamentary petition that asks the lower, and by way of the lower house of parliament, the upper house of parliament, asks the Australian government to get the requisite committees to investigate think tank brink tanks in this country that are obviously acting as agents of foreign influence for foreign intelligence agencies. I'm Dr. Bruce Long, and thank you for your time.